book of Numbers. A couple of points as far as outlining the book. And outlining the book of Numbers is actually really, really hard to do because it meanders so much. The book of Numbers, the tales aren't always chronological, and they kind of go back and forth. And it seems like the outline of the book of Numbers mirrors the people's wandering. The people wander all throughout the book of Numbers, and the way it's written out kind of wanders and meanders as well. So it's probably the least organized book within the Pentateuch. And you think that is shown by the fact that the people of Israel are the least ordered in as far as the book of Numbers is shown. So a couple of aspects, and what we're picking up on is right out of here. So before the text, the people spend 2 years at Sinai, and leading up to chapter 11, they're preparing to move into the promised land. Right? So everything seems very hopeful right before we get to our chapter 11 text. Right? Everything has been built, everyone's on their way, they're going to pick up and move right into the promised land. But right before the spies are sent out, there's a couple of testings that they go through. And this chapter 11 is one of the big ones. So, with that quick little aspect, what I want to do is play a little video that outlines the book of Numbers for us.
The book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories. But let's remember, it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are
And you can be a monthly supporter too. I really enjoy how well those people put the different books of the Bible together. It's a fantastic ministry that they have. So, as Travis read in our text, you see in verse 1, verse 4, kind of the complaining begins, right? In verse 1, the people complained. Verse 1. And then verse 4, into it now the rabble that was with them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept again. Said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." Right, so there's just this grumbling and complaining and this weeping that the group of Israel begins, and that is just all throughout the book of Numbers. Just a grumbling, hesitant, unfaithful people who are rebelling against the God that's delivering them, saving them, and bringing them into the promised land. Just a really bizarre scene. But one of the things that you see is in Moses' speech, verse 11. It says, "Why have you dealt with your servant? Why have you dealt ill with your servant? Have not found favor in your sight, and lay the burden of this people on me? Did I conceive this people, bring them forth? You say, come on and carry them into your bosom, and as a nurse carries a child to the land that you swore to their forefathers." So Moses is looking forward to the promised land. Right? Moses is looking forward to see where God is taking his people. And that's where his direction is. It's forward to the promise. But go back to verse 4. "Oh, that we had meat to eat. We remember the fish that we ate in Egypt." So Moses is looking forward. Where are the people looking? Backwards. That creates an absolutely impossible leadership situation. Absolutely impossible. When the leader and God's leader wants to move the people forward, and all the people think about is, "Oh, remember when? Remember back in the day? Wasn't it so much better then?" Impossible leadership scenario. Can't lead. Can't do anything. You're stuck in a quagmire. You're in quicksand. Can't do anything. The harder you try, the worse it gets. Right? So Moses is so burdened by this. Look at verse 15. Look at verse 15 again. Travis read it, but let's look at it again. "If you will treat me," this is Moses talking to God, "if you will treat me like this, kill me at once. If I have found any favor in your sight, that I might not see my own wretchedness." Right? That he's so convinced that there's nothing that can go well anymore, that this people will not obey, they will not move forward. They're so stuck in Egypt. He says, "You know what? Just kill me now. Just get it over with so I can't stare my own failure in the face anymore. So I can't see my own wretchedness." Right? Because the people's recalcitrance is, in Moses' eyes, a symbol of just kill me. Get me. Right? That's the burden of leadership and the cost of God's people refusing to move forward. So there's two main principles I want to look at with just this first point, this complaining aspect. One of them is that going from where you are to where God wants you is always going to cause you to be somewhat uncomfortable. Any progress, any movement is always going to be somewhat uncomfortable and be somewhat inconvenient. Right? I used to lift a lot of weights, and the only thing that causes you to be able to lift more, right? If you want to break the 300-pound bench, you have to consistently hurt yourself. Right? It causes a lot of pain in the gym and afterwards, but that causes the growth. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable and inconvenienced, right? Taking 2 hours out of your day to go to the gym, eating the right amount of protein and everything else. When you have a goal ahead of you, any progress forward is always going to cause you to be somewhat inconvenienced and not be so comfortable in your flesh. It's always the case. It's always the case. So the Israelites were more eager to follow food than they were to follow God. If you look at that, that we could fill our bellies with good things and garlic and leeks. They're more eager to gratify their stomachs than they were to obey and to follow God's leading. But I can't help but think that we are too. We're often more eager to allow convenience to shape our decisions than we are to allowing God's glory to shape our decisions. One question you might ask yourself. And what are our excuses when we miss worship? When we miss a time to gather with God's people, study His Word, grow stronger together as a community of faith, to be built up, to build one another up, to worship the Creator of the universe. What are our excuses? I want to watch a guy hit a ball with a stick. I mean, is that really a good excuse? I mean, is that something that we want to look at the Creator and say, yeah, I didn't worship you today with your people that you saved through your blood because, that's nap time. I'm not saying, you're commanded to be here Sunday mornings and Wednesdays or whatever, but it's an aspect of priorities in my mind. It's an aspect of where are we putting our focus? Are we putting our focus on allowing our conveniences to be met more so than we're allowing God's glory and His Word to shape His people together? I think too often we sound a lot like the Israelites, just whining, but I don't want to go to church. That guy insulted me. Grow up. I mean, honestly, Paul worshipped in the same church with the people that he was trying to kill. They accepted him. But someone says something that we don't like, and we just back out sometimes. It's pathetic in a lot of ways. And one of the things that's irritating, I guess, to me about this is saying this, the people typically who get convicted about something like this are the ones that are going to show up anyway. And the ones that aren't going to show up, it just washes away. Sometimes it just seems like you might as well not say anything because it's not going to get heard. Asking to hear it. What are our priorities? Is it worship, studying God's Word with each other, being built up together, loving one another? Or is it just allowing the things of Egypt to drive our passions, to fill our bellies? I want to get out by 12:30 or whatever because, I'm a bit hungry. I mean, what's driving our passion? What's driving our motivation? Is it convenience? Where are we being driven? Back to Egypt or forward to glory? What are we pursuing? What are we pursuing and who are we following? So, all that to say, God's leaders cannot move His people forward when they're stuck in the past. Can't happen. Can't happen. It's impossible. And there's a whole lot of kind of remember when. Remember when. And that happens, I hear it regularly about remember when America was so much greater, back in the 50s or whatever. It's like, yeah, depends on who you were. Sometimes you can't eat in the same restaurant as other people. Sometimes you can't, it depends on who you are. In some cases, our country is a lot better now than it was. It's all a matter of perspective. Really is. You also hear the same thing within the church. Remember back in the day when the churches of Christ were so much better because it's like we're not there anymore. That's not where we are. We're not in the 50s. We're not in the 80s. It's not where we are. We're moving forward. Right? Time marches on, and we have to march with it. It doesn't mean we have to accept everything, from the past. It doesn't mean we have to accept everything from the future and just accommodate culture. But we have to be moving forward. If we're not, we will die in the wilderness. That's just the way it is. So then, what's really amazing is that God provides for the people's needs of leadership, and then for the people's greeds, right? For quail. Yea, meat. God establishes a system of leadership. It's a really beautiful picture, right? That God gives. I will take some of the Spirit that is on you and distribute it among this group of 70. It's a really powerful picture then mirrored in the New Testament with Jesus sending out the 70. Then there's that guy who's casting out demons that it wasn't part of the original group. It's a really amazing mirror in the New Testament, right? The feeding with quail is very similar to Jesus' feeding the 5,000. It's a very beautiful image in the New Testament that mirrors the Old. But anyway, he provides for the leadership needs. It's distributed among God's leaders, his Spirit and the authority to lead. But one of the things you notice is that the leadership is evidenced by spiritual activation, right? They're prophesying. They're bearing spiritual fruit. Just one necessary component of leadership among God's people is it's first and foremost spiritual. Leadership among God's people is not just physical. It's not just how can we make sure the budget's right. There are needs among God's people that have to be met. People are sick. People are hurting. There are needs in the community. People are lost and dying in sin. We need to band together to meet those needs. Spiritual leadership is a leadership that says we're convinced that there's a need and we have to fill it. It's our calling. And then the fruit from that is born out. So, he provides meat, 18 through 23. But if you look at that passage, going over to it, verse 18 says, "And say to the people, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat. For you have wept in the hearing of the Lord. Who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and you have wept before him, saying, why did we even come out of Egypt?" Rejecting the present provision of God. God calls that rejection of him. It's important. Saying, I wish we could go back to the before time. I wish we could go back then. God says, you've rejected me. He's saying that because they've rejected his work in the present. Moving forward is painful. Moving forward as a church isn't always easy. But the more we say, I wish it were back in the 80s. I wish it were back then. You're rejecting God. You're rejecting what God's doing. Rejecting God's work is rejection of him. Wishing to be back in a time that doesn't exist is rejecting what God is doing right now. It's important. It's important that we understand that. Complaining, grumbling about our present circumstance is refusing to see what God is accomplishing right now. That's not saying you can't bring up an actual problem, discuss it, address it. That's totally different. Right? Like, disagreeing with me, I'm not saying is disagreeing with God. I'm not saying that at all. Disagreeing with the leadership in the church is not the same as disagreeing with God. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is grumbling, recalcitrance, I don't want to do anything with the church anymore. That is more along the line of what we're talking about. It's a dangerous place to be. It's a dangerous place to be, and we'll see that in a second. So the text doesn't say they didn't believe in God. That's not what it says. The text says they wish they were back in Egypt. And God says, that's rejection of me. Right? They're weeping and wailing because they wish they were back before when they could eat the food of slavery. It's not a good sign. So, even now, if you look at verse 20, over to verse 20, the people's lack of faith causes Moses to even doubt. You look at 21. But Moses said, after God promises the food, Moses said, the people whom I number 600,000 on foot, and you have said, I will give them meat to eat, that they may eat for a whole month. Shall flocks and herds be slaughtered for them, and be enough for them? Or shall all the fish in the sea be gathered together for them, and be enough for them? God, this situation has caused enough discouragement for Moses that he's even forgetting the power of God to cross the Red Sea, the power of God to smite the Egyptians, send plagues. Now he's saying, how can this possibly happen? And God takes issue with him. God takes issue with him. He says, and the Lord said, verse 23 to Moses, the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's hand shortened? Now you shall see whether my word will come true or not. So all this discouragement begins to take its toll on the leadership. They start to doubt that God's capable. Right? The more God's people hold back, refuse to move forward, the less able his leaders are to do their job, which ends up being a giant discouragement and begins to take its toll on their trust that God is actually working. God can do this. And it just spirals downhill. It just spirals downhill. So the more reluctant God's people are to serve, to be on mission, to be a community, to trust God to move forward, the more reluctant they are to do that, and the more they complain and grumble and moan, the less of an effect God's people can have on the community, and the less motivation God's leaders have to actually do their job. Just spirals down until a church or a people of God die of apathy. It's not a pretty death. So the greatest prophet in Israel's history now is doubting God's power. That's what this rabble has done. These moaners and complainers. So a few major principles of that. Leadership among God's people is first and foremost spiritual. First and foremost spiritual. The emphasis on leadership among God's people has to be on the spiritual well-being of his people and on the community. Spiritual leadership must also be evidenced by spiritual fruit-bearing, and that's what you see with the prophesying, that there's evidence that they are a spiritual leadership and that God is working through them. Right, so leadership among God's people must be spiritual and bear spiritual fruit. So rejection of God's provision in the present and nostalgia for the comforts of the flesh is tantamount to the rejection of God. Right, so again, what are our excuses for not following God, for rejecting, meeting with his people and everything else? What are our excuses? Are they flesh-oriented or spirit-oriented? What are our excuses? Right? Reap to the flesh. Sow to the flesh. Right? See what you reap. It's not good. When God's people lose focus on the future, God's leadership begins to doubt. The leadership among God's people begins to doubt. And a doubting leadership can't produce spiritual fruit. Can't happen. But it is a consequence, as we see here. Main point of all that. Fear, doubt, lack of focus, grumbling, and complaining, right? Sowing to the flesh. Look what it reaps. You go to verse 31. Then a wind of the Lord sprang up, and it brought quail from the sea, and let them fall beside the camp about a day's journey on this side and a day's journey on that side, around the camp, 2 cubits above the ground. The cubits the size of a forearm, roughly. And the people rose all that day and all that night, and all the next day, and they gathered quail. Those who gathered least gathered 10 homers. And they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. While the meat, so he gave them what they wanted. Right? He let them kind of gratify their flesh. But while the meat was still in their teeth, before it was even consumed, the anger of the Lord was kindled against the people and struck them down with a very great plague. Therefore the name of that place is Kibroth Hativa, because there they buried the people who had the craving. Right? So again, sow to the flesh, see what you reap. It's not good. It's not a good day. It wasn't a good day for the God's people. They got their flesh satisfied, but didn't end well. And rather than just ending on a downer, God gives a greater grace for us. God's grace is greater than our grumbling or our problems. Go over to Philippians, and we'll close on this reading, or right after this reading. Right after. I'm not going to say on it because I got one more thing to say. I want to get your hopes up. Chapter 2. Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. Right? Work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Right? Remember this scenario in the wandering. It's God who is working in them to bring them out of Egypt, to take care of them in the wilderness, to bring them into the promised land. It's God who works in you, both to will, he causes the desire, and to perform it. Verse 14. Do all things without grumbling or disputing. Why? Previous verse. It's God who's working among you. So if you're grumbling and disputing as a community through whom God is working, what are you grumbling and disputing against? It's God and his work. You don't want to be there. That you may be blameless and innocent children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world. What a beautiful picture of what the church should be. A shining light of unity, of love, and of devotion in the midst of chaos that we find out in the world. What a beautiful picture of who we should be. Among a crooked and twisted generation, and no one here probably disputes that that's what's going on out in the world. Crooked and twisted. We have the opportunity to be radically different, but it takes being radically different. You may shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Right? That's Moses' problem, that I just kill me so I don't see my own wretchedness. Right? He's like, just continue to perform God's work, shine as lights, don't grumble, don't dispute, be a unified body of love, so that I don't come to the end and say, why did I even spend that time with you guys? Even if I am poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. He's talking about his death. He's talking about his execution at the hands of the Romans. That he can go to the guillotine happy. That he caused and bore spiritual fruit among God's people. Like, help me to go to the execution chamber with a smile on my face, is what he's asking. Likewise, you should all be glad and rejoice with me. Right? Not grumbling, not complaining. That God's people should be a body of rejoicing and of joy and of gladness and of hope. Right? Not because we do everything right, we have all of our boxes checked, but because the God of the universe loved us. He took on a body of flesh, lived sinlessly so that he could bear all of our guilt, all of our shame upon him on the cross, so that we could receive his righteousness, his hope for eternal life and a hope of resurrection and a new creation. We should be a body of people that are just focused on that, going towards that, moving towards the new life with Christ, not back to the way things used to be, the way I wish things were, to satisfy my conveniences, but moving forward to a new heaven, new earth, with new bodies to be with the Lord forever. Would you pray with me, please? Dear Lord, we thank you very much